at this presentation around vaccinations, particularly around the COVID vaccinations. We've just got somebody on a camera there. We're asking everybody if you wouldn't mind keeping your cameras off and staying muted during the presentation. We will be taking questions through the chat, so feel free to pop them on during the presentation, but we will be dealing with them at the end of the presentation. So it's a situation of sit back and listen, make your notes, and then send us your questions at the end. I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Andrew George and Professor Katie Urch, who will introduce themselves and their credentials in presenting this talk to us today. They have also filmed this previously, and we have shared it with our students and had lots of discussions in college around the vaccinations. And we've got a whole raft of questions that our students have also sent in to be asked today. So hopefully you'll find that we've got lots of different perspectives coming through. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew and Katie. As I say, keep your microphones off and your cameras off if you don't mind, please, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fiona. So Kate and myself will be talking today about the coronavirus vaccine, but we'll be trying to talk for a relatively short period of time, because I think the really interesting thing is to get to the questions and to find out what people have to say, what people are feeling, and then have a chance to perhaps answer questions that people will have. But if we could introduce ourselves first. My name's Andrew George. I'm a research immunologist, so I've spent most of my career working on the immune system, developing various treatments for cancer and other diseases. I also have played a major role in research ethics and continue to be involved in the way in which clinical trials are approved in this country and making sure that's rigorous, and in the adoption of innovation in the NHS. And I'm also happen to be chair of RAC as well. Katie?
Thank you very much. I'm Katie Urch. I'm a consultant at Imperial College Healthcare in Northwest London. I'm also part of running the hospital, and so I'm responsible for a lot of the surgery and a lot of the intensive care, which I think is quite important. I've also been very involved, obviously, in supporting the vaccination programme within our trust, and also understanding much more of the research side. And partly I'm the chair of one of the research ethics approval committees, and so we've been very involved in all the approvals and the safety part.
Thank you, Katie. So what we're going to cover today in our talk before the questions is a bit about how vaccines work, which I will do as an immunologist, and then what are the COVID-19 vaccines and how new treatments are approved, which Katie will be leading on. So if I can start with what for me is probably the most fascinating part of the human body, because I'm an immunologist, and that's the immune system. The immune system is a wonderfully complex system that's there to fight disease, and vaccines work through harnessing our natural immune system. The immune system is totally natural, and what vaccines do is they harness that immune system to fight disease. And so what the immune system normally does is it prevents us from getting sick or deals with our sickness when we have viruses, bacteria, or parasites. And it does this by recognizing the invaders that invade our body and then producing molecules like antibodies or producing cells like T cells that can then destroy those invading organisms. But one of the most fascinating things about the immune system, and the reason why we can use it to prevent disease, is it has a memory. And so if you are infected with a virus or bacteria, and then you encounter that virus or bacteria again later, you respond faster and stronger, and that protects you from disease. And that's shown here in this graph. And so in this graph, along the bottom, we have time, and it shows at the beginning there's an initial exposure. And then up the side, it shows the amount of antibody, but we could be measuring other things, but this is the amount of antibody that is produced following the infection. And you can see that for quite a period of time, typically 2 weeks to 3 weeks, it takes before you make any antibody. And then after that period of time, you make some antibody. Hopefully you clear the bacteria or the virus, you get better. And then the antibody levels slowly start to fall. And they start to fall away. And so you get less and less antibody present. But then what happens if you get a second infection, which is shown by that arrow in the middle that's labeled secondary exposure? You will then see that you get a much more rapid immune response. That immune response typically happens in 2 to 3 days. And it's also much higher. You get much more of it. And also, actually, the immune response is stronger in itself. It's a better immune response. And it's this rapid response when you see something for the second time is what protects you from bacteria or viruses or other organisms that cause disease. And so what immunization does is it works by replacing that initial infection, shown here with that rather disgusting sneeze that somebody is doing, a way of getting infected. You can get infected with a sneeze. And it's exchanging that, an infection that causes disease, with giving you something that mimics the infection, but which is safe. And so what it does is, by mimicking the infection, it actually harnesses our natural immune system, and that immune system then responds thinking that there's an infection and is therefore ready to protect you when you then do get an infection. So I'm just going to give a little bit of history here, because I think the history here is fascinating. It's also useful sometimes to put things in context. So this first disease which we were vaccinated against was smallpox. Smallpox, it's difficult to realize now, but it was such a feared disease in its day. The death rate, if you caught smallpox, could be as high as 30%. And in the last 100 years of its existence, it probably killed 500 million people, we estimate. And when you read accounts of what it was like in towns and villages when smallpox was in a neighboring area, the fear that people had that they would get it was so immense, much stronger than anything we've ever had with COVID, because the death that smallpox caused was so massive. And that people also who didn't die of smallpox were often were normally scarred for life and could often be made blind or have other problems. And what Edward Jenner did, Edward Jenner was a doctor in Somerset, and he recognized that milkmaids didn't seem to get smallpox. And he thought that this might be due to the fact that they'd been infected with a similar organism called cowpox, which they caught when they were milking cows. And so he took cowpox, in fact, from this cow that's in this picture. This cow is called Blossom. It was a cow in the local village where he lived, and he got cowpox from it. And he vaccinated people with cowpox. And then he showed that it protected them from getting smallpox. And he did that in 1796. And the success of it was so massive. Jenner was hailed as a hero across the world. And over a long period of time, that caused us to start a vaccination program that eventually led to smallpox being declared as eradicated in 1980. And this just shows you some figures from smallpox. So at the left of the graph here, we have in London the percentage of people who in their lives would die the percentage of deaths in any 1 year, caused by smallpox. And so you can see that between 5 and 10% of people of deaths in any 1 year were caused by smallpox before 1796. The green line in the middle shows 1796. That's when it was eradicated. When Jenner invented the vaccination. And then you can see very rapidly the tail off of the impact of smallpox. And so by the mid-1850s, the incidence was very low. And by the 1900s in London, it was virtually zero and nobody was dying of smallpox. And of course, we've forgotten about this because we've now eradicated smallpox. And so people are not dying and need not be at fear of smallpox. So what sort of vaccines are there? Well, there are many types of vaccines. I'll go through this quite quickly, but some vaccines are caused by taking the virus or the bacteria and then killing it, and then using that to immunize it. So it's been killed, so it's safe. An example of that are the influenza vaccines that we use every year. In other cases, organisms have been grown in such a way that has made them incapable of causing disease, but still capable of stimulating the immune response. And an example of that is the BCG vaccination for tuberculosis, or the measles, mumps, and rubella. Other bacteria cause disease not by the bacteria themselves, but by toxins that they release. And so, for example, if you get tetanus, the problem is not caused by the bacteria directly, it's caused by the toxin that the bacteria released. And in those cases, you can take the toxin, you can inactivate it, we call them toxoid when you do that, and you can immunize against that. So in that case, you're immunizing against the effect of the bacteria, not the bacteria themselves. And in other cases, you can take the infectious organism off, typically a virus. You can take a very small part of it, normally the coat protein. And I think Katie will be talking a bit more about the coat protein of coronavirus in a moment. And you can take a little bit of the coat protein and you can immunize against that one. And so you can't get disease because it's only like a very small part of the virus, but you can take an immune response that protects you. Now, more recently, other vaccines have come through. The first of these is the recombinant viral vaccines. And in this case, what you do is you take a virus that causes mild disease or no disease in humans. And the most common ones used are adenoviruses that cause the common cold. And then you put into the virus a very small part of the virus that you're wanting to be protected against. And so then what happens, you can give that to people. The people are infected with the adenovirus, which doesn't cause them any harm because we're used to seeing adenoviruses. They're around all the time. And then what you do is you make an immune response against that small bit of the virus that we've put in, and you end up then protecting yourself against the dangerous virus. And an example of that that's been used recently is the Ebola virus. And then the final sort, or a new sort, which are called genetic vaccines. And these are vaccines where you strip things back to the very, very basics of it. So you go back to the code, the DNA or the RNA that encode the virus, that actually that direct what the virus does. And you just take small bits of that code and you inject those into people. And then what happens is people can make not the virus, but can make small bits of the virus, which then produce the immune response. And so this vaccine is totally safe because it's no infectious agent whatsoever. And these have been developed by people to treat cancer, for example. Now, there's some features of vaccination which are important to realize. One of them, of course, which we've realized, which you'll be well aware of from the COVID vaccination, is it takes time to stimulate the immune response. As I said before, it can take 2 to 3 weeks often to stimulate the immune response. And so once you become vaccinated, you are not immediately protected. It takes time for that immune response to kick in. The other thing you saw in the graph that I showed you is that the immune response dies back after a while. And so it falls down after a while and gets less and less and less. And so eventually the protection goes down. And in those cases, what you need to do is you need to do a booster. So you need to repeat the immunization. And that causes the rapid rise again in antibodies to ensure that you remain protected. The other thing is that organisms mutate and change. And if they mutate and change, you sometimes need to change the vaccine. And that's the case with influenza. So for example, every year there's an influenza vaccine. That's not because the influenza vaccine is bad, it's a very good vaccine. But what happens is the influenza changes every year. And so we need a new vaccine every year because the influenza changes. And the other thing which is very key is that vaccination does protect you from infection, but it doesn't confer superpowers on you. If you are vaccinated, you still can get infected. It's just much harder for you to get infected, and you tend to get a less severe infection. But it still means that you have to take protection. For example, the doctors and nurses will still wear PPE when dealing with COVID, even though they're vaccinated. And so vaccination can stop you from getting symptoms. It can stop you from being seriously unwell, but you can still be infected. You can still be infectious. And indeed, you might get some symptoms. They're just likely to be milder than they would have been if you hadn't been vaccinated. So I'm now going to hand over to Katie, who's going to talk a bit more about COVID-19 and the vaccines we specifically have against that. Katie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. So everyone is fully aware now that we hadn't seen this virus really before 2019. And there were beginning to be reports back in November of that year from China that there was a new form of coronavirus. We know coronaviruses a lot. They often produce common colds, but this was a new one that seemed to be making people very unwell. And initially, if you all remember back to that point, initially, the symptoms were things like fever and cough, and people classically lost their sense of taste and smell. And that's because of being infected with the virus. However, many people had no symptoms at all, and that's not uncommon. If you think about the common cold and all of us passing infections to each other all winter, all the time, some people get very ill, some people get mildly ill, some people have the odd sneeze and have nothing else. And it all depends on how briskly our immune system can clear the infection. So we know with coronavirus, about 80%, the vast majority of people either have no symptoms or very, very mild symptoms. They might not even really notice that they've got an infection. However, something between 15 and 20% of people have really quite severe symptoms, some of them severe enough to need to come into hospital. And we have about 5% of people who end up being critically unwell and need to be in intensive care. And unfortunately, many of them die. A proportion of people with any infection can go on and have very long-term complications. And COVID is no different from many, many other viral infections. And that's partly due to the way our immune system reacts to the virus and unfortunately begins to either attack our own bodies or consequences of the infection, like clots and organ failure. We get COVID classically through droplets, through the sneezes that Andrew was talking about. So what's happened with this infection? It's a very infectious organism and it's run around the world several times now. And you can see here that really millions and millions and millions of people have been infected, and many of you will know that people can be infected more than once. It's disrupted our lives, our economy, our social life, our healthcare systems, and actually for children and young adults, very often their education as well. When we first met this virus, it had a very high mortality, something that us in healthcare, we just were not used to seeing this degree of death from an infectious diseases. That was in the Victorian age, and this was the first one of modern age to be such high death rates. And so the hunt was on to see, could we try and treat this? Could we treat patients better? But also, could we prevent people being unwell? So the way we try and prevent people getting unwell to begin with is looking at the virus itself. And this is a little diagram of the virus. And you can see inside are the code that Andrew was talking about. Here it's an RNA code. And these are the code, the building blocks that the virus needs. Unfortunately, the virus hasn't got anything else. It can't do anything. It needs our cells. It needs to hijack our cells and insert that code and make our cells do the work, producing more viruses. It's a very, very sneaky little mechanism. On the outside, to protect that little code that it's basically got a little cap, a little membrane protein, and really importantly, it's got what we call spike proteins, and you can see them here called spike glycoproteins. And those are very key and distinctive in this particular coronavirus. So what we've done is we've taken that structure of the coronavirus and we've now tried to make vaccines. And basically, they go through the same manufacturing, testing, and safety requirements that everything else does before it goes into a human. But usually vaccines can take decades to be produced. And we've got faster and faster. Ebola showed us how quickly we could respond. That took about 2 years. And really the world turned its scientific and production efforts towards coronavirus. The UK, we are extremely lucky. We have already got a very, very strong vaccine research culture. And in fact, that's where Ebola virus vaccine came from and many of the cancer vaccines come from. And we were also very fortunate that many of you and many people in the country volunteered to take part in vaccine studies, and they were conducted across the world with all different types of vaccine. We still had regulation, we still had to make sure it was safe. It's just we cut out a lot of the paperwork, a lot of the duplication, and we made everything very streamlined. And so we went at risk commercially, and we also just made everyone work faster and more productively. Out of all the vaccines that have been made, and you will all know many vaccines have been made, we have 4 which we have approved of in this country. It doesn't mean the others don't work, it's just we have focused our attention and our approval on these 4. And so most people here will have heard of the Pfizer, and many people, if you've had vaccination, will have had a Pfizer vaccination. We've also got the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccination, and those are the 2 main ones in this country. The Moderna and the Janssen, or the Johnson & Johnson, have come in just a little bit later. They all seem pretty much as good as each other. The first dose, as Andrew was saying, gives you some protection, usually somewhere between 50 and 60%, not a lot. Your second or booster dose, your second dose will give you a much stronger protection and boost you right up to somewhere between about 80 to 90% protection. But what they are all doing, 100%, is they seem to really confer 100% protection from very severe disease, and ideally prevention from death. So what type of vaccines are these? These are often new vaccines, that modern way of producing vaccine. So Pfizer and BioNTech, they've just taken some of that RNA and shielded it and give that to us. And so what we're trying to produce is antibodies and protection against that genetic code. That genetic code on its own can't give you the coronavirus. It can't do anything to us. It's just there to stimulate our immune system, to pretend we've already seen COVID. Oxford and Janssen and others give you a type of modified virus. So they're taking parts of the virus, parts of the spike protein, modifying it into in the adenovirus in this case, and giving that to us. And so our bodies again are tricked into seeing and making antibodies against the spike protein, thinking it's coronavirus, but we're not ill at all. Others is here, you can give inactivated viruses or viruses like coronavirus, which have been made weaker than they are. Now, nothing in life comes for free, and there are always the potential for side effects. And what we hope is any drug, any vaccination, anything we put into our body has more benefit than risk. And this is really important. Now, you've got to remember the risk of getting coronavirus for some unfortunate people is to die. And so we have to try and say, how safe is this for everybody to try and stop some people dying? And in fact, these vaccines are incredibly safe, incredibly safe. The most common side effects are a sore arm. And then because you're mounting an immune response, sometimes you get a bit of fever or a headache or feeling tired. They're usually mild. They usually go with some simple painkillers. There are some very rare, more serious side effects. All of these serious side effects occur much more commonly if you have coronavirus. So inflammation of the heart is about 5 in a million after the vaccination, but can be as high as 20 to 30 in a million if you got coronavirus infection. The central venous thrombosis that caused a lot of concern and clotting occurs about 6 per million after a vaccination, especially with the AstraZeneca. However, this kind of clotting was probably the most common cause of death, and again will occur in 20 to 30 per million in this serious death way in coronavirus itself. But what about pregnancy and breastfeeding? So at the moment, and for the hundreds of thousands of women around the world who've had a vaccination, we've actually, thank goodness, seen no side effects, and more importantly, no risk to the fetus. And that's really important for us to know. And that's really important because we do have evidence that people and women who get infected with coronavirus have a much higher rate of premature birth. They seem to have a much more severe illness, especially with the new variants coming through. And unfortunately, when you're very pregnant, if you are very unwell, we just cannot ventilate you and look after you. And therefore, we have to deliver the baby, even at risk to that baby. We also started looking at fertility, and do not use the vaccination as contraception because it doesn't work. Vaccination has no effect on fertility. How do vaccines get approved? How do we know they're safe? We keep telling you they're safe, but how do we know? So everything we put in our body goes through a huge amount of regulation and testing, gets tested in the laboratory, get tested all the way through. But then what we have to do is actually put it into some people and say, we're going to follow them. Those are called trials. And we start by putting it into very few people called phase 1. And if it looks safe in just those handful of people, nothing bad happened, we move out into phase 2 and phase 3. Now, usually all of those happen one after each other, and we look at the results. In this case, because the world was so unwell and so many people were dying, we ran those phases almost overlapping. And so as the information came out, we started the next phase. And to be honest, they were so safe, and we saw so little short or long-term effects that they ran very, very quickly. And at risk alongside it, our commercial companies and our universities started large-scale mass production, even when phase 2 was running. So well before anyone even could think of putting it into a population, the manufacturers were already gearing up, ready to go. And tens of thousands of people went through these. And then finally, all that information had to be looked at by several different committees, all checking and challenging each other before it got final approval. So what are some of the myths and beliefs? Well, some people say, can't I catch COVID from the vaccine because I feel unwell, I might have a fever? You can't. On all the vaccines we've approved in England, none of them actually are full viruses. They're only bits of viruses or bits of the code. So unfortunately, no, you cannot get COVID. Can they make you infertile? No. These are vaccines. All they're doing is mimicking your natural defense. They are just strengthening your immune system and giving you a head start. So no, they have no effect on fertility. Fertility is completely separate and different, and they are absolutely not a contraception. There are plenty of people, loads of people who are pregnant after having the vaccine. There's also the worry that they contain things. They might contain pork, contain alcohol, other things like that. There's no room in a vaccine for anything else to sneak in. The manufacturing, absolutely, we do not want any of those ingredients in there because people react to them. And so they are very sterile and very much just made up of the proteins that we need you to react against, usually in a solution of normal saline. Do the vaccines contain fetal cells? No, they're not grown on fetal cells. We don't need to go anywhere near fetal cells. They're nothing to do with that. They are just created by chopping up bits of DNA, bits of RNA, and bits of the spike protein. So it is very clever, very, very new technology. And once I'm immunized, you're kind of superhuman, you're totally safe. And of course, no, unfortunately, they're not 100% safe, and they don't 100% protect you. What they're doing is boosting your immune system, strengthening it, giving you that head start. So when you do see the real virus again, your body is saying, I've seen it before, I can crack on and start fighting it. So yes, you can be ill when you see coronavirus. Yes, you can have symptoms. You know, yes, sometimes you even have to come into hospital. But at the moment, I've got no one who's made it to ICU and who's died just from having coronavirus after they've been vaccinated. That's in our hospital. And we just are not seeing reports. So on the whole, what it does is boost you, gives you that head start, but it doesn't make you superhuman. So what about all these variants that we hear about? And what about people being worried? You know, if I get the vaccine now, what about everything else? The virus is out there to replicate. And every time it hits a wall, like someone is immune to it, it can then start changing. And on that change are called variants. And you can see on the graph on the left, there are just thousands of different ways the virus keeps trying to evade us and keeps trying to mutate. Most of them don't go anywhere. But some of them actually are more infectious or make people more ill. And you've all heard of the different variants, the beta variant, the delta variant, and they've arose in different countries. It doesn't matter where they arose from. All it shows you was there was just a lot of virus around, all circulating, all changing. And as soon as one's faster, stronger, better, it wins and gains the upper hand. So we had the alpha variant that went around the world. We had the beta variant from Kent. We have the delta variant from India. And they circulate because they're better, faster, and stronger. Do the vaccines work? Thank goodness, yes. So far, all the variants are susceptible to our vaccination. And so now it's over to you and some questions.
I'll just stop sharing the screen. Thank you, Fiona. I think it's over to you now, isn't it?
Sorry, I was just struggling to unmute myself. Okay, thank you, everybody. There is opportunity now for you to post some questions. So if you want to pop them in the chat, please, that would be really helpful. For those that joined us slightly later into the presentation, we are recording it. So if you did miss the first parts of the presentation, we will be sending that out to you so you can catch up on anything that you might have missed. Also, Katie and Andrew quite kindly filmed this previously, and we have been sharing it with our students in different types of classes, and they've been collating questions, so we can actually kick off with a few questions from our students while we gather questions from the audience this evening. So I'll start with some questions from our ESOL learners. These are students for whom English is not their first language. One question is, I'm concerned about the long-term effects of the vaccine. There's no information on this. So how can I be certain it's safe?
I think it's a really good question. And I think right back at the beginning, 2019, 2020, you're absolutely right. When those very first people were very first volunteering to be part of the studies, we didn't have that information. We now have got almost 2 years, 18 months worth of data, and we're very sure we have no long-term side effects from the vaccination. You've got to remember, these are just bits of protein and that they stimulate your immune system. Your body will break them down and get rid of them and leave behind your immune system, and that's what they leave behind. As Andrew showed you, though, your immune system says, oh, that's okay, I got stimulated, now I'm going to go back to sleep, I don't need to bother with it. And you need to keep reminding, keep waking itself up again. So we are very, very sure there are no long-term side effects. There are some very rare side effects, like I told you about. The inflammation around the heart seems very short-lived. We haven't seen long-term complications. The clotting we can now treat and manage. So again, very few complications. There are some unfortunate people, very, very tragically, who've died from having clots. But again, we are much more aware of them now and can treat them. So I would have to say, remember, it might be 1 in a million from a side effect from a vaccine, but it might be 30 in a million. You're much more likely to have much more severe, life-threatening side effects or death from the coronavirus itself.
Thank you. Why do some people who've caught the virus have no symptoms?
It's yeah. Shall I take that one? I'll take this one to hear my voice for change. That's really interesting, but it's probably how any one of us who gets if somebody sneezes next door to me when they've got a cold or something like that, what is it that determines whether I will get infected or not, or have the symptoms or not? And it's going to be lots of things. It's going to be how much dose of the virus I got, how much did they sneeze over me? It's going to be what was my health at the time, what was my immune system doing at the time? It's going to be down to my previous history. Had I been infected with a similar virus last year, which gives me some protection or not? And all of these things sort of come together to mean that some people are asymptomatic when they get a cold, and some people, as Katie said, get the cold really, really badly. And it's the same with COVID. The history of how you are infected, or your previous history, the amount of infection you got, your state of health at the moment of infection, and also a bit of blind luck, I'm afraid, will also determine why some people get it really, really bad and some people don't. Of course, we know that there are risk factors that mean that you are more likely to get a bad infection, you're more likely to suffer symptoms, age, being male is bad news to some extent, having some pre-existing conditions also is bad news. So there are lots of conditions that make you more at risk for it. But it's other than that, it's a slightly random mixture of different combinations that cause that.
Thank you. I'm going to just switch over to some questions from our audience this evening, because they're coming through quite nicely. So there's a couple of questions I'm going to wrap up together, which is around the booster. Somebody's saying, what next? How will we take the decision on what happens beyond the booster? And somebody else is asking a similar question, which is, how often will we have to have the COVID boosters?
I'll start with the booster, but I'll let Katie do the more clinical side of it. I mean, what we don't know yet fully is how often we will have to have the booster, because we don't have that data. There are studies at the moment going on to see how long the booster actually lasts. And indeed, I'm part of one of those studies. I'm a participant in one of those studies. And so they take my blood regularly to see how long the immunity will last, and also what the nature of that immunity is. At the moment, the booster is being recommended. The booster is being recommended, I think, 6 months after your first dose. What will happen next is going to depend upon the nature of those results. Will we need to have boosters every year? Will we need to have boosters less frequently? And that's also going to depend upon how the virus mutates. So I think the answer is we don't know, but what we have got is we've got a good handle on it now.
Yes, I just want to echo that. Obviously, after you've had your first 2 priming doses, if you like, to get that initial response and the good response, then we seem to say in average people, we have a sort of forgetting by the immune system and a gradual waning. And it's not that by 6 months suddenly it all turns off. It's just in proportion. Instead of having 90% of people protected, you might only have 60% of people protected. And so we just remind the immune system, it's just re-triggering it. And as Andrew said, it might be every year, but we're all expecting a coronavirus over the next 5 years or so to weaken and go away. So it might just be for now, but not forever. And that's just remember, the scientists are always tracking the variants. So they are testing, and we've been part of a study that testing different variations of the vaccination. So don't worry about that. They're one step ahead of the virus.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of questions around fertility. I know you picked that up already in your presentation, but there's one question around, will the vaccine affect fertility for girls aged 12 to 15 in the future? And a second question around that, which is, do you think we have enough evidence and conducted enough trials around fertility?
So both of those answers, it is safe. So it's actually really hard to affect fertility. I mean, it's really hard. You have to take really hormone reducing drugs consistently in order to affect fertility. This is part of your own natural defense system, and it's really important to remember that. Your own natural defense system produces antibodies, produces T cells. We do it all the time, every day, every minute of the day. And all the vaccine does is just boost that. It doesn't actually go very far from where the injection site is. It doesn't circulate around the body. It doesn't do that. It just gets taken up by the cells where you get your injection. And then all it does is those little cells say, hello, I think I'm producing a different spike protein, and your body produces antibodies. Those are antibodies only against the coronavirus. They're not against any other bit of you or any other virus. So it is absolutely actually impossible for this to affect the fertility, which is a complex axis and really much more hormonally driven. It's just frankly impossible. There is just no mechanism for it to affect fertility. And that doesn't matter what age. I think one of the questions is the 12 to 15-year-old girls. It actually doesn't matter whether they are prepubescent or whether you're post-pubertal. It just cannot affect fertility. You've got to think of the number of times you've had a common cold or you've had any other infection. It doesn't affect your fertility. It's exactly the same. The common cold, your immune response doesn't affect your fertility. It can make you feel pretty awful, but it doesn't affect your fertility.
And I'll just throw in something as a sort of historian of science. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things is every time a new vaccine comes, this fear of a loss of fertility is actually something that people jump on and build up. But it's never been seen for any vaccine. It's never been seen for any vaccine. And so it's really interesting that there is this big fear which has never materialized, but people keep repeating it generation after generation.
Thank you. I'm just going to hop back to some questions from our students. So we have somebody has said that they've heard that there are a lot more people infected with COVID in places like America than, say, Africa, where they don't have as much access to the vaccine. So America has access and Africa doesn't. Why do you think that is? I mean, obviously this is probably some hearsay, but
well, it's not just hearsay. So obviously we only know about who's infected if you've got testing. So you've just got to remember that testing regimes are really, really quite country specific. They are predominantly in developed countries rather than the underdeveloped countries, and it's just very expensive. So if you are a developing country and slightly poorer, where are you going to put your money? You're probably going to put the money into treating people and probably nowadays into trying to get the vaccine. You're not going to be spending your money on testing people. Whereas America, Europe, Australia, Russia, we test an awful lot of people. And you might have noticed that we report very high rates of coronavirus at the moment. We don't have many people in hospital, we report very high rates, and Europe doesn't. And the big difference there is Europe has basically stopped testing children for coronavirus. So if you go to school, they're not being tested routinely. We carry on testing. So we pick up thousands of children who are asymptomatic and going about their daily lives quite happily, but we know about them. If you don't test them, you don't know about them. The other very, very sad thing is that in many of the African countries, they simply do not have many old people. So unfortunately, people are dying at a much younger age from a whole variety of other illnesses. And we do know coronavirus on the whole is more symptomatic and certainly much more obvious in an older and iller population. So that is it's a sad fact of the differences between a very rich nation like America or Europe and poorer nations.
And I think it's also probably fair to say that there are differences in social behaviours between those countries. We expect to be highly connected. We live in a city where there are lots of people travelling between each other, and that has enabled in the early days infection to spread. If you live in a more rural, less interactive community, then it's going to take longer, and COVID is likely to be always at a lower rate, though obviously it can still devastate individuals. It's likely to be at a lower rate. So differences in behaviour are also going to be key to that as well.
Thank you. We're getting lots of more interesting questions coming in. Somebody has said that, do you think the 12-week interval between the 2 jabs for the Pfizer vaccine was a mistake? The person says they ask this because we know that trials were conducted in mostly healthy young people. This is obviously somebody from a doctor's surgery, and at our surgery it's when we started the younger 30 to 40 cohorts that we found they caught COVID after 4 to 5 weeks of having had the first dose. That's quite a long question.
So there's several things there. So the initial trials and the time between the 2 initial doses, right back at the very beginning, we're talking about 2020 here, were chosen just being very pragmatic. We knew we probably had to give a first dose and a second to prime that immune system, to really boost it up. And just the only way you could get through all the regulation and all the testing was to make the 2 doses very close together. And that's why initially it came out as 3 weeks apart. However, because we knew that you could either do a few people with double dosing or many, many people with single dosing, we extended that and said, have many, many more people have your first dose, and then 12 weeks later have your second dose. It's not a fixed interval. It was a pragmatic decision to get millions of people vaccinated. Can you remember back to Andrew's slide where he showed you that after the first dose, you got some protection, that little response for your immune system? We know about 40–50% response after your first. You need your second. So that question from the GP surgery is absolutely right. But after the first dose, there will always be a significant proportion of people who still get COVID, because whilst out of 100 people we've protected some, half of them, the rest of them have a very weak response and are still can get COVID. And that's why the second dose is so important, to really boost it up so that 80–90% of people don't become ill with COVID.
Thank you. Another person has said thank you. It's really interesting talk, so that's good feedback for you. Do you think it's likely that a variant will arise that is resistant to the vaccines? And if so, will we be able to develop a new vaccine quickly?
So the answer to that one is a complicated answer, because I suppose the basic story is that we don't know. It is possible, that it is absolutely possible that a variant could arise that escapes a vaccine. We know that happens for other infectious agents as well. I think the thing that gives me comfort, there are two things that give me comfort for this. One of the things that gives me comfort is, in spite of the millions of people who have been infected in countries that are vaccinated, we haven't yet seen it. The variants, as Katie said, the variants that we've seen so far, some of them have had a slightly increased, reduced susceptibility to the impact of vaccination, but it's been very, very mild, hardly at all. And so I'm sort of hopeful that we won't. So I'm hopeful that we've actually got the bit of the virus that it can't mutate, and it can't mutate because if it stops mutating that, it's infectious. But I'm afraid time will only tell. What I would say is that since we know the vaccines that we have at the moment work, actually it is very, very fast to change those vaccines. So for example, the trial that I mentioned I'm taking part in as a volunteer, I may have had, I don't know, because I don't know which arm of the trial I was on, but I may well have had a vaccine against one of the variants, because you can make those vaccines very, very quickly. So while it would cause a major headache because it takes time, as we know, to make enough vaccine for everybody, we actually would be able to do it much faster this time to get the vaccine, because it would be a case of slotting out the old bit of the vaccine and slotting in a new bit of the vaccine, which is technology that in the laboratory is very easy to do.
Thank you. We also presented your film to our learners with special educational needs, so adults with learning difficulties and disabilities, many of whom would be in that vulnerable category. So it was interesting that we got some questions from them, if I can ask you one or two of those. Yeah. Somebody has asked, well, first of all, the first question was, will the jab hurt and will I be sick from having the jab?
On the whole, actually having the jab doesn't really hurt. It's an incredibly thin, small needle. So most people, when I was giving quite a lot of vaccinations, they're surprised by the time I've talked to them, it's all done and finished. Will they be sick? As I said, some people do find their arm hurts. That's probably the most common one. The next most common symptom is to have a bit of a fever or feel tired or a bit unwell. It's usually only a couple of days. Which is much better than being really unwell and perhaps even in hospital with COVID itself. So I always tell people they can take a paracetamol, they can take something else just for a few days until they're over the worst of it. But on the whole, most of the people forget they've had it.
An interesting question as well from that group was, does it matter which booster I get?
That's a really interesting one.
Yes. Oh, I mean, I think the data is still emerging from the boosters and the exact and the exact nature of it. I think we're tending towards the Pfizer-BioNTech from some of the
booster,
boosters.
yes, and it doesn't the data
Doesn't
seem to show.
It doesn't seem to make. I mean, there may be small differences, but the data certainly doesn't show any major difference. So I think again, a lot of the studies at the moment are looking at different boosters, and so you know, I had Pfizer as my main immunization, and so the trial I'm in is to check that AstraZeneca works as the booster, and actually it does seem to work as a booster. So yeah. I don't think it matters particularly which booster you have.
The other trials have done the other way around,
yeah.
having AstraZeneca first and Pfizer second, or Janssen second. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all, and that's because all you're doing is reminding the immune system again about part of the infection.
Yeah.
I have somebody that said from our audience this evening, I had COVID-19 in July, even though I was double vaccinated. I still lost my sense of taste and smell. Do you have any data about whether the booster will protect me further?
So just remember, it's not going to give you superhuman powers. So the vaccination is to protect us, and it seems 80–90% of us will be fully protected. It has 100% protection, or seems to be, against very severe illness and death. And so can we still get COVID infection? Yes, of course we can. We seem to get it milder, and we seem to shake it off more quickly, and that's what you'd expect. You've seen it before. Your immune system kicks in, fights the infection, gets rid of it. So yes, I'm afraid you can lose your sense of taste and smell. You can still have a headache, a fever. There are still people who seem to be really quite unwell and even come into hospital having had the vaccination. But just remember, they may have been the people that died without having a vaccination. So just remember, we are seeing people, some people, a very small percentage of people who still get infection and can get really quite unwell. But actually, the death rate has really virtually stopped. In vaccinated people, we are just not seeing death from COVID. Obviously, they carry on dying from heart attacks and road traffic accidents, but not from COVID. Unfortunately, the ones I have in ITU at the moment who are ill with COVID are all unvaccinated, and we still have plenty in ITU. So just remember that. So will it make you superhuman? No. Will your booster mean you never get COVID again? No. Will it give you an additional protection? Yes. It just reminds your immune system again, hey, wake up, keep yourself alert, keep active, because you might see the virus coming round.
There's another question from our ESOL learners. Why don't just the vulnerable get vaccinated? Those that are at high risk, as opposed to all who have low risk of serious illness. Wouldn't this mitigate the risk of any unknown long-term side effects of the vaccine?
Good question.
Yeah, yeah, and that is a strategy that one could take. One could take the strategy of only immunizing people at high risk. The problem with that as a strategy is that it's not binary. There's not that there are some people at very high risk and some people at very low risk. It's a gradation. Where would you draw the line between those people? And the other one is, of course, that we are also, when we are being vaccinated, we are doing two things. We're protecting ourselves, but we're also protecting everybody around us, because we're stopping ourselves from spreading the disease. We're reducing the chances of other people catching the disease from us. And one of the things that is a key feature in immunology is this concept of herd immunity. Now, we're not going to all the way to herd immunity there, but we are going to a situation where the more you reduce the transmission through the population, the better you are able to control it, so that you protect both the vulnerable people who either haven't been vaccinated or who are particularly at high risk, or the people who are even less vulnerable, who are less likely to get the disease but still might get the disease, or indeed the people who are low risk, who are at very low risk of it. So it is important to try and get the whole population, so we stop spreading it to each other. And I think that if you look at schools, I think that's the greatest reason for thinking about why you might want to vaccinate people, children at schools. Children at school are very, very unlikely to get harm from the vaccine. They're also actually quite unlikely, very unlikely to get harm from getting COVID. They might be infected with COVID, and some of them do get bad COVID, but on the whole, it's milder than people of my age, certainly. But actually, the reason why you want to vaccinate those young people is to stop them spreading it to other people, and also to get them their lives back, so that they can then start going to school again, they can start socializing again, and they can start taking part in society again.
And I just say one other thing is that when we first met this virus, I think the people who seemed to be most devastatingly affected and died were the more elderly and the more vulnerable. However, obviously, as we've protected that group, what is emerging are the younger people who perhaps got lost in the sheer numbers before. And it's devastating when you have a 30 or 40-year-old who is unvaccinated and dies from COVID. And yet you wouldn't consider them vulnerable. And so, like Andrew was saying, it's all on this gradation. The Delta variant seemed to be much more severe in pregnant women. They were never considered high risk before. And yet the Delta variant was absolutely heartbreaking when we had pregnant women in ITU and we were having to make decisions with their partners to take the baby out early in order to save the mother where we can, or unfortunately in some cases that the mum died. And yet, how can I say they weren't high risk? It just, the variant emerged. And so really there are so many reasons to protect everybody by everybody having a vaccination. But it's a really good question, and one that certainly we have been on numerous debates about over the last 2 years.
And I think there are other things as well you need to consider which are interesting, like the actually also we want to reduce the amount of virus circulating when we've got immunized population, for the reason of the earlier question, to reduce the risk of a variant emerging that escapes the vaccine. So it's a really complicated ethical issue, this one, but I hopefully we've given some pointers that people can use in their thinking.
I know we're coming close to the end of our time, but there was one more question hopefully I can ask you. And I think we will think about how we can respond to some of these questions on our website, perhaps an FAQs or a Q&A document that we can publish. But is there any update on the effectiveness of the vaccine booster on those immunosuppressive drugs, for example, steroids and biologics?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. So we know people who are immunocompromised because of either they're on drugs, like you just mentioned, some drugs that suppress your immune system, or they have a disease which suppresses their immune system. They have a much poorer response, as you'd expect. We're turning off their immune system. And so you wouldn't expect them to have such a good immune response to anything, any infection or a vaccination. And so we do know most of the trials have been done in cancer patients, because we have good access to them. And certainly we know people who are immunosuppressed have a very low production of antibodies post-vaccination. And so a lot of my very immunosuppressed patients, we will give them multiple shots of the COVID vaccination, more than 2, more than 3, in order to try and just give them that little bit more protection. But the disease and our drugs are busy trying to stop their immune system responding. And so they remain very, very vulnerable. So in answer to your last question, there's a very vulnerable group who have a very high chance of dying if they got coronavirus. And one of the reasons why we all need to be protected in order to help protect them. So for them, yes, we do often give them multiple doses, often at a time when we think, oh, the immune system can just respond. Let's see if we can give them a dose. The booster is the same as the primary, and so we would use the same principle. We're just trying to wake that immune system up enough to fight the coronavirus, but are not enough to bring back their disease.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of our allotted hour. Thank you so much for presenting this to us again and giving us a really interesting update, particularly with all the new learnings that we've got over this time. Thanks everybody for joining us. As I've mentioned, we will be sending this film out to you. We'll email everybody that registered today. and also we will look at how we can get some of these Q&As up on our website. But for this evening, thanks very much, Katie and Andrew. That was as interesting as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Bye-bye.